All right, I'm very excited about this video. This is going to delve into how you can use the use case profile that Magic Draw, aka Cameo Systems Modeler, has built into it. And one of the nice things about this is you'll actually end up seeing how these use cases, such as included use cases and the extended use cases, fit in nicely with your typical basic flow of events that will possibly have alternative flows. What I'd like to do is actually delve into an example that I created with a generic missile system that is using ChatGPT, actually. In this case, I wanted to come up with some generic launch missile use case. So what I did was ask ChatGPT to simply write a use case scenario for a missile launch. The missile is a ground-launched missile that must be launched from a tube by a person pushing the launch button, and asked it to include the basic flow of events, alternative flow of events, and exceptions. ChatGPT gave me this series of events. Notice we have the basic flow of events. It starts out with a precondition, which is nice, and then also these other 8 steps. And then one of the most important parts of use cases in writing use case narratives is to identify the alternative flow of events and exceptions. So ChatGPT nicely created some possibilities here. So what I would recommend doing is, if you had a list that you were writing out, and it's always great to write these out at first, you can simply copy and paste this. But what you would do is actually create a use case. And if you do not have the use case profile loaded, if you were to open up the specification for any use case down here at the bottom right hand side, what you'll see is a little button, if it's not loaded, that says load use case profile. So after you've loaded the profile, you will see some things change slightly, such as you'll have numbering for your use cases. What I would recommend doing is, after you've copied that basic flow of events, you can simply enter that into the use case scenario flows. So this is a great place for that data to live in your model. So just do a Control V there, and now we have our basic flow of events. And then the next thing we'll do is go back and grab that alternative flow of events, and you will see how this all fits in perfectly. So we will have alternative flow of events, and then we have the exception flow of events. We'll go back and grab the exceptions, and then you can simply paste that in. That is where that data will live in your model. Now what you can do is actually automatically generate a sketch of this, or have Cameo create an activity diagram based on those events by simply adding those in one at a time, and then those become the actions in the activity diagram. Now you could obviously go in and manually create that activity diagram yourself as well, but what's neat about this is you can see how the off-nominal scenarios play into this with the alternative flows and the exception flows. So let's say we wanted to add in the first step in this, which is that the operator who has the authority and necessary authorization approaches the missile launch system and verifies the target coordinates and other necessary parameters. So that is the first step. What you would do with that is go back to this sketch and then use this option here to add a new step. Now you have to add these in one at a time, unfortunately. But what's interesting about this is, if you were to click on one of those, you can then connect an alternative flow to that and an exception flow. Now, as we go through this, you can click the button here to automatically begin creating that diagram. So if I were to say open and update, Cameo automatically generates that activity diagram and puts that text onto the actions. Now notice these are actions that are not defined by any activities or any other types of behaviors. And we will jump into what it looks like when you have included use cases and extended use cases, and how that looks when you do define these. The next thing we would do would be to go back and grab that next step, which is the operator takes position in front of the launch tube, and then you can add that into the sketch. So if I were to enter this in now, you'll see that update automatically, and you see that text update here. Now, let's say that we want to put in some type of a decision node. That is where the alternative flow of events comes in at. In this scenario, what I did was put in all of this data here, and then went to the use case scenario sketch, and then we have operator confirms the target coordinates. Then notice it has the A1 next to that. That's because I clicked on that step and then went to the alternative flow. And if you add a new alternative flow, what it does is it creates a branch, but it's a decision node that looks at a condition to decide whether or not something is true or false. If we look at what Cameo and Magic Draw have in their documentation, this is what you see is that is what ends up being an alternative flow. And then down here you have a structured activity node, which is where you'll end up seeing your exceptions. So a basic flow of events would typically go straight through, but then any of these little branches are what you would consider an alternative flow. The next question is, well, what happens if we have an included use case or an extended use case? If we delve into this use case here, this would be considered our alternative flow, where I enter in the condition, which is issues with the target coordinates. And in that case, we would do this action. Otherwise, we would use the else and continue on this basic flow of events. Now, when we get down to here, this is an example of an included use case, because an included use case is something that happens every time that use case flow of events occurs. It is included, and this is where it is included, is at this specific point. Now, the next question is, well, what does it look like if it's an extended use case? So let's go back and look at the use case diagram. Notice the extend relationship points directly at the launch missile use case. So what we're saying is this use case extends this use case. But notice in parentheses, this is the extension point or the condition that has to occur in order to cause that to be invoked. So it says missile fails to launch. And if you notice, that directly correlates to the name of this decision node. Name that decision node the exact same thing as the extension point of the use case. So if we go back and look at the launch missile use case, notice it has a defined extension point. If we look at the specification for this and we go down to extension points, that is simply missile fails to launch, and that directly correlates to the name of this decision node, which would be the extended use case. So it's considered an extension because only in the case that this missile launch is failing do we then execute this behavior that would then delve one level deeper into defining this action. So if we double click on that, notice we're right back here, and this is the procedure that would be invoked to perform that extension of this use case. The other thing that we have not discussed yet are the exception behaviors. So exceptions are different than extensions. So keep in mind, this is considered an extended use case. These, however, are considered exceptions. An exception is something that is handled by an exception handler. So this exception handler comes directly off of this action. Notice there is no outgoing pin out of this because this is considered an exception handler. The idea is you will define a class. So this delves a little bit into UML rather than SysML, but you can define a class similar to a block that would be the definition of what would cause that exception. So in this case, notice we've defined that pin or the exception as a communications failure. So that is what would be the trigger for this exception. And what we're saying is when this action is actually executing, if there's a communications failure while this is executing, then this exception behavior would be performed, which is this structured activity node that would then delve into, it could be a long list of actions that has to happen in order to resolve that exception. In the Magic Draw documentation for this, they recommend only having one exception handler for each one of these actions. That may be something to put a little thought into as to whether or not that makes sense for you or your project. Obviously, for this, I added a few other exception handlers here. So in this case, we said in the case of a power loss or interruption while this is executing, this structured activity node sequence would handle that exception. That is a very interesting concept in how all of that correlates. That's something that I don't believe a lot of people understand about use cases, is that there is actually a direct correlation between extended use cases and included use cases and how that looks in an activity diagram. What we can also do is run a simulation of this. If you're in a use case diagram, not a block definition diagram, but a use case diagram, you can actually simulate the diagram. And if you have an image loaded or an image set for your block that has associations to your use cases. In this case, I went in and actually set the image icon for this block called the launch crew. What you'll see is Cameo will put that image on this graphical user interface that they create for you, and then you'll have the ability to trigger any of these use cases that would then delve into these other use cases. So in this case, we could simply say launch missile, and it'll start going through our events that we've defined here. So issues with coordinates, we'll say no, and then that will continue down the pathway. Obviously, this is the included use case. It delved into that, completed that, and now it's coming to that extension point where it says missile fails to launch. And in this case, we could say yes, and it'll delve in. No issues found, and then we'd report that error, and then that use case has completed. The last discussion I want to add on to this is what can you do with those use case scenarios and why are they so valuable? So the valuable aspect of having your use case narratives written is that you go through after you've done this and pull out all of the nouns, and those nouns become the domain objects in your domain model. And the domain model is something that you create prior to your logical architecture. So as we go through this basic flow of events, what you can do is change this to an HTML mode. You can bold all of these nouns that you find, and those can become the objects or the blocks in your domain model. And that is extremely valuable because those will then correlate directly to your use cases. The next question is, how detailed should these domain objects be? This is a very rough cut at a domain model where you would go through each one of those steps and identify some of the nouns in these. The way you know how detailed these should go is that all of these objects should be something that the user understands. So in the case where we know this missile might have a microprocessor, we would not include that microprocessor in the domain model. That would be something that would show up in the logical architecture, however, but in the domain model, we want to have all of the objects that the users of that system would be able to understand from their perspective, from that user perspective or from that external system perspective. We can go ahead and even start the beginnings of a logical decomposition, which would begin here for our system of interest, by saying, hey, in that use case, we've already identified that there is a launch button, so there's no need to treat this as a black box. What we're now considering this is a gray box. If there is something that the use cases have identified that is an object, even if it's a part of that system, let's go ahead and call it out now, because this will become the glossary for our system. And this is how we can converge on terms very early on in a project. All of these items that we see here will then have a place in the glossary. And if you have multiple people working on use cases, this is a great time to converge on your terminology. If you have any questions on this, please reach out to STC and we would be happy to help your team. We have over 120 model-based systems engineers ready to help your organization. Please feel free to reach out to us and we would be happy to help. Thanks a lot.